So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Schottlander, the University Librarian here at UC San Diego, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to Geisel Library this afternoon. And you might well wonder, well, what's so particular about today? Don't you do this all the time? And you would be right. I give a lot of such introductions, and I'm always happy to do it, but it's a rare thing indeed when I get to do so for one of my own librarians. So I'm very pleased to be celebrating the work of Sarah Buck Kachaluba, whose book I've already bought my copy of, who along with her colleague Aaron Dziubinskyj edited and translated this newly released book, Eugenia, a fictional sketch of future customs, which has just been published by the University of Wisconsin. The book originally appeared in Mexico in 1919, authored by Eduardo Urziz, which I may be mispronouncing, a Cuban physician, teacher, journalist, and scholar. And it's notable for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's one of the very earliest novels to consider the subject of eugenics in a popular culture context. And second, it is the first science fiction novel published in Mexico in the 20th century. We're fortunate to have Max Pera with us today, who is a professor of Latin American literature here at UC San Diego, who in a few minutes will shed some light on this fascinating book for us. But before he does, let me tell you a little bit more about my colleague, Sarah. Sarah joined the UC San Diego Library about a year ago as the library's Latin American and Iberian Studies and Languages librarian. Her BA in History and International Affairs is from the University of New Hampshire. Her master's degree in Library and Information Science is from the University of North Texas, and her PhD in History is from Rutgers. Sarah's research has focused on women's history, gender roles, and population and reproductive politics in 20th century Latin America, with an emphasis on Mexico. And as a librarian, she has studied the advantages and disadvantages offered by digital as opposed to print humanities research, resources, and digitization. She has studied the development of the electronic book and the future of the book in general in Spain and Latin America, and is working herself on a digital scholarship project based on oral histories of women who were members of revolutionary women's leagues between the 1920s and the 1940s. Before joining the library in June of last year, Sarah served as the humanities librarian at Florida State University, before which she was an assistant professor of history at Allegheny College. Just this last week, the seminar on the acquisition of Latin American library materials, also known as SALAM, awarded Sarah the Jose Toribio Medina Award for her work on Eugenia, acknowledging what they describe, and I couldn't have done so better myself, as her truly superior accomplishments in research and scholarship. So you can see why it's a particular pleasure for me to be welcoming you this afternoon. Now Professor Pera will share with us his thoughts on Eugenia and the new book, following which Sarah will give a presentation on her work and we'll have some Q&A. So, Professor Pera.
Thank you, Brian. My name is Max Pera. I teach literature, Latin American literature, in the Department of Literature, and it gives me great pleasure to participate in this book talk on Eugenia, I'll say it in Spanish, a fictional sketch on future customs, a translated critical edition by Sarah Buck Kachaluba and Aaron Dziubinskyj, and published, as you can see, by the University of Wisconsin Press in February of this year. So thank you, Sarah, for inviting me here. I'm going to repeat some of the things that Brian just said, and then I'll move on to talk a little bit about the book and about the articles in this book. Sarah Buck Kachaluba is, of course, as it has been mentioned before, the Latin American Studies and Iberian Languages and Literatures librarian here at UCSD, and with a master's degrees in Library and Information Sciences from the University of North Texas, which is how I and many of us came to know her. So she's also a historian with a PhD in history from Rutgers University, where she wrote her dissertation on activists and mothers, feminist and maternalist politics in Mexico from 1923 to 1953. She has written extensively on women in Mexico, especially about those in the Yucatan, covering the subject of suffrage and feminism, and has done a great deal of her research in Yucatan. Indeed, well-known researcher and historian of feminism and women's struggle for equality, and the vote in Mexico, Ana Lau Jaiven, she's a very well-known scholar, has acknowledged Sarah's contribution to the field. Her article on La Organización de la Mujer Yucateca, 1923-53, appeared in the Historia General de Yucatán, published by the Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán in 2014. Her latest project is to create an interactive site with the interviews she conducted in 2000 in Yucatan with former members of revolutionary women's leagues of the 1930s and 40s. In 2014, she spent 6 weeks in the region working on this digital scholarly project and also provided copies of the above-mentioned interviews to the women's family members and local cultural repositories of their communities, which also received the audio tapes. Using digital technologies will enable community members to edit and improve the transcripts, upload additional information, and even chat. Given her background and knowledge of the history of Mexico in the early 20th century, and her research on gender, politics, and culture in Yucatan, Sarah was uniquely qualified to work on this critical edition in collaboration with Spanish literature professor Aaron Dziubinskyj of DePauw University. Sarah wrote 2 historically oriented essays for the book, and Dziubinskyj was mostly responsible for the translation and the final essay. Eugenia was published in 1919 in Mérida, Yucatan, where the author, the Cuban-born Eduardo Urzaiz, was a well-respected physician and writer. Urzaiz' Eugenia is a science fiction novel that envisions life in a city called Villa Utopia, or Villa Utopia, in the 23rd century. In the novel, the institution of the state is in charge of human reproduction, and artificial insemination is a common practice. Knowledge is transmitted via hypnosis. Flying bicycles and moving sidewalks transport people to their appointed destinations. Free love is openly practiced and rationalized, and taboos like smoking cannabis is accepted. To understand these disconcerting ideas and how a physician from a small provincial city came to write one of the foundational texts in the science fiction literature of Mexico, the editors include, as I mentioned before, 3 essays that help the reader navigate the complex history of the period and the intellectual genealogy of the book. Eugenia belongs to the tradition of narratives inspired by the eugenics movements of the 19th and early 20th century. The antecedents of Urzaiz's works are Justo Sierra's and Andrés Molina Enriquez's sociological writings on race and nation, though neither of them ventured into the realm of fiction. Sarah, in her essay Eugenia and Eugenics, reconstructs the ideas on heredity, human degeneration, and racial improvement, and the belief in the perfectibility of the human race produced in Europe, and their appropriation by the scientific community of Mexico during the long dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, and how these ideas evolved during and after the Mexican Revolution and became enmeshed in notions of hygiene, healthy bodies, and the creation of a new society. Interestingly, the closest intellectual affinity to Eugenia is to be found in José Vasconcelos's famous utopian essay, The Cosmic Race, published in 1925. Sarah mentions in the introduction that Urzaiz met Vasconcelos in Mexico City in 1922. It is therefore conceivable for Vasconcelos to have received as a gift Urzaiz's work of science fiction. An attempt in speculation would be to determine if the novel influenced Vasconcelos' own creative process. As Sarah points out, there are many points of contact in Urzaiz's novel and in Vasconcelos' essay. such as the frequent references to the classical tradition of Greek and Roman sculptures as models of human beauty, and to Latin America's pre-Hispanic architecture, in addition to the social Darwinism underlying their racialized observations and the source of biases and contradictions in both works. From the formal point of view, the novel has its limitations. Following the essayist tradition of the Latin American novel, Ursais uses characters as mouthpieces to convey to the reader the dreams of the freethinker he was. These dreams were provocative and highly unconventional for the time period, and even for today. However, they were curiously conveyed in a writing style that was slightly anachronistic, even for 1919. Ursais is not interested in linguistic experimentation, using different narrative planes to tell the story, or in shifting points of view. His prose is clear and even-handed, and the story's chronology is predictable and uncomplicated. Aaron Dziubinskyj notes in his essay on the literary genesis and genealogy of Eugenia that the reception of the book confounded the critics because the ideas were so groundbreaking, not because of the writer's narrative technique. Dziubinskyj also locates the book in the larger context of the science fiction literature of the period, positioning Ursais' novel alongside the works of H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley, as well as insightfully discussing its place in the vast literature on utopian societies. Finally, it should be noted that if Ursais' views on race are at times troubling, his treatment of gender and gender relations is surprisingly advanced for the Mexico of the Revolution. As Sarah carefully explains in her remarkable essay, Social and Biological Reproduction in Eugenia, the history of women activism in Yucatan during the revolution provide the backdrop for many of the dialogues on health and reproduction, sterilization, birth control, and motherhood. Her essay illuminates women's struggles for constitutional rights and what can be called the politics of the gendered body. Without knowledge of these mobilizations and the impact they had on public policy after 1916, it would be difficult to understand the radical views on sexuality introduced by Ursais in his novel. There is a long tradition of superb U.S. scholarship on Mexican literature and history. It is a scholarship that combines rigorous critical thinking, erudition, and empathy for the culture of Mexico. This critical edition belongs to that tradition. It is undoubtedly the most complete contribution to the study of Ursais' novel and to its place in the history of science fiction literature, not only in Mexico, but in the larger scene of world literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max and Brian, for your very kind and informative introductions. I just wanted to say a little bit about Max's work as well. Max is in literature. His work is really eclectic. He has done translation, he has done historical analysis, he has done literary analysis on a number of different subjects and themes. And like me, he's a Mexicanist, but his work is very grounded in Latin American studies and in an interdisciplinary context. So that and the fact that he was very interested in this project when I met him for the first time last summer made me really pleased that he could be here today to do this introduction. So thank you both. In addition, I want to thank everybody at the library that has helped make this event happen. That includes Dolores' team, Mariah, Nikki, and Dolores, who took care of all the details, Seraphine, Raya, who did the beautiful poster publicizing it, and also my IT support, Mark and Dan. And thank you all as well for being here today. This is very exciting and very special for me. This project has been a long time coming. It actually started almost 20 years ago when I ran across a first edition copy of the novel Eugenia in an old bookstore in Mexico City Centro. And I recognized the author as a medical doctor who was involved in a birth control campaign in the state of Yucatan that I was studying as part of my dissertation work on women's organizing. So I purchased the book, I read it, mentioned it briefly in the dissertation, but it really haunted me and I wanted to find a way to do a broader project on it. So it's, of course, very satisfying to see it finally come to fruition and to have all of you here today to share with that. Okay, so I'm going to be moving back and forth today between sort of reading from the book and talking about it. So I'll start with a little passage. In the prologue to his novel Eugenia, Eduardo Orsais writes, "I too dream often, and in my dreams, dear reader, I contemplate a humanity that is almost happy, free at last from the shackles and prejudices with which today's humanity willingly complicates and embitters life. The simple love story that unfolds in this attempt at a novel has served me only as an excuse to conjure up a vision, even if pale and imprecise, of that future humanity of my hopes and dreams." Written in 1919, the simple love story created by Orsais is set within the futuristic community of Via Utopia. I guess I use a Spanglish pronunciation. The capital of a subconfederation of Central America in the 23rd century. In Via Utopia, Orsais imagines a political economic order free from many problems, defining his own early 20th century community of Mérida, Yucatan, Mexico. These problems include stark class differences in poverty, incurable disease, and social unrest. And I have a few slides. This slide is a map of Mexico, just so I can show you. Here's Mérida over here, and then it's fairly far from Mexico City, which is Mexico's center. So Mérida really was, and even today is, periphery in a Mexican context and in the world. In 1919, the city of Mérida, the state of Yucatan, and the entire country of Mexico had just emerged and begun to recover from the Mexican Revolution, a divisive, destructive, bloody civil war, which would launch Mexico into several decades of rigorous social and political economic experimentation and reform. And I have a series of images of the Mexican Revolution just to give you an idea of some of the range of experiences that it included. Eugenia shows us that in this post-revolutionary context, 1920s Mexico was as complex and roaring as the 1920s United States and Europe, defined by economic and commercial growth, new women who were called chicas modernas in Mexico, who worked, smoked, wore bobs, and had sex outside of marriage, the increasing use of automobiles, airplanes, telephones, and electricity, and the emergence of radio and film, and specifically Latin American forms of jazz music and dance, as well as increasing faith in scientific and medical intervention to solve human and social problems. This is a series of buildings that existed in Mérida at the time that Orsais wrote Eugenia. I do wish that there was more green and foliage in them because Mérida was and is today very tropical and very humid and therefore provided a very different kind of context for this science fiction novel than contemporary novels, which are more cold and aseptic, kind of such as We and Brave New World. In Eugenia, Orsais shows us that Mexicans knew about and experienced such modern 1920s trends by describing inventions and practices in the futuristic world of Via Utopia, including hydrotherapeutic electronic bathing equipment, aerocycles for individual transportation, as we've already heard, automatic curtains to regulate lighting and temperature, and androgynous clothing. And there is no better example of androgynous clothing, androgeneity, and even a 1920s aesthetic in general in Eugenia than we see on the book's cover. Another 1920s characteristic of Eugenia is the reference to Neo-Mayan and Art Deco influenced architecture. And this is the Casa del Pueblo, which was initiated in 1928, which is a prominent example of that. A final theme in Eugenia that is evident of the 1920s is the rejection of marriage and nuclear families, and the reliance instead on free love and a publicly regulated reproductive apparatus, through which selected breeders create biologically desirable offspring who are raised in state facilities until they are old enough to choose their own non-nuclear families based on affinity of character for social and biological reproduction. And the woman on the cover of Eugenia is actually Celiana, the oldest female in a 5-member non-nuclear via utopian family that is composed of 2 heterosexual couples and a single man. In devising this alternative reproductive system, Orsiz demonstrates an apparent utopian vision of eugenics. And before I continue, I want to pause here to flesh out both of these terms. Utopia is a literary genre to which Eugenia belongs. And it's also a literary and historical concept referring to an imagined, perfect, blissful world and used to critique real, including historical, and imagined societies. Eugenics, according to 2 leading Latin American historians, can be defined as a scientific approach to, quote, managing the hereditary makeup of the human species, quote, and as, quote, a set of theories and policies aimed at controlling and monitoring the reproduction of individuals and social groups, quote. Although popular knowledge tends to associate eugenics with World War II and the Nazis, eugenic strategies have first of all varied significantly. On the one hand, there have been positive eugenic initiatives encouraging individuals and groups displaying desirable biological and social traits to reproduce. Such initiatives include environmental reforms, maternal and child welfare programs, public health campaigns, and pronatalist propaganda encouraging reproduction. Some examples of pronatalism include images of pregnancy, childbirth, and children. At the other extreme, there have been negative eugenic practices aiming to limit or prevent the reproduction of individuals or groups displaying undesirable traits. Negative eugenic strategies include sterilization, contraception, segregation, abortion, and in some cases, decisions to end the lives of the weaker or less fit through euthanasia or non-intervention in the case of illness, injury, or maldevelopment. Second of all, eugenic strategies have constituted an appealing tool for social and political reformers across the globe for a long time. Eugenic practices are described in Plato's Republic, and Francis Galton coined the term eugenics in 1883. So eugenic initiatives appeared well before World War II, and they've continued to the present day. The intersecting themes of eugenics and utopia are central to the story told in Eugenia. The novel centers around selected breeders who leave their non-nuclear families to fulfill their eugenic duty to via utopia. Thus, although the title of the novel, Eugenia, represents the name of one of the story's main characters, a beautiful young woman who is selected as an official breeder by Via Utopia's Institute of Eugenics, the subtitle, A Fictional Sketch of Future Customs, also points to 2 related and at times conflicting understandings of eugenics. First, as a scientific project, and second, as the idea or dream of a social utopia that incorporates eugenic ideas. As the novel begins, Eugenia appears to be a utopia. Initial chapters draw a vivid picture of Via Utopia, whose very name contributes to the image of a perfect, pleasant, civilized, and peaceful community. As a world defined by the triumphant conquest of modernity achieved by the supreme reign of technology, where humans gain control of economic, political, social, and biological reproduction. Orsiz's self-stated goal in the prologue of evoking a vision of the future humanity of his hopes and dreams reinforces the reader's assumption that the novel is a utopia. Yet, as the novel unfolds, some of the social dynamics that Orsiz describes challenge his vision of a perfect society, indicating that Via Utopia has not found answers for some of the more difficult aspects of the human condition. And it becomes less clear what Orsiz's intentions are, or whether the novel is actually a utopia after all. Later chapters make it possible to also characterize Eugenia as dystopian literature, which, quote, situates itself in direct opposition to utopian thought, warning against the potential negative consequences of errant utopianism, quote. All of the above, Eugenia's rich description, themes, and unresolved tensions make the novel a fascinating window into Mexico and the world in a particular historical moment, 1919, just after the Mexican Revolution and just before the 1920s, a decade of dramatic social, economic, and political reform. that also connects to and grapples with universal issues that are still relevant and unresolved today. To give you an idea of the richness of the text, in the remainder of my talk today, I will read a few selections from the novel, followed by very brief comments highlighting key themes that these passages raise. Dr. Remigio Perez Cerrato, director of Via Utopia's Institute of Eugenics, was one of those uncontrollable talkers who, when no one else was around to listen, spoke to themselves or to their office furniture. Since the inexhaustible flood of his learned discourse had a hypnotic quality, finding an attentive listener was especially rewarding for him. That day was particularly satisfying, since propitious luck had given him an exclusive audience with two important Hottentot doctors, who, sent on a scientific mission by their government, came to study ways to introduce into their country effective means to prevent the evolutionary stagnation of their race. When Ernesto, carrying Miguel's business card, arrived at the doctor's office to announce that he would accept his appointment as official breeder and to inquire about his subsequent responsibilities, the African doctors were already there. Dr. Remigio was pleased and made formal introductions. Mr. Ernesto del Lasso, one of our most distinguished breeders, the wise doctors Booker T. Kutsube and Lincoln Mandinguez, worthy representatives of medical science in Hottentot. Ernesto greeted them with a bow. Smiling, the Africans displayed their pearly rows of formidable cannibal-like teeth. One young and the other old, they both were ugly, thick-lipped, and had a comical air of frightened curiosity about them. They spoke perfect English, and their gestures were animated. The elder, with his long white beard, looked like a domesticated chimpanzee. To properly indoctrinate his visitors before showing them the departments of that vast institution that was his responsibility, and above all, to take complete advantage of their audience, Dr. Remigio began the conversation with a discussion of the earliest origins of eugenics. Had it been possible, he would have begun with prehistoric times. You should remember, distinguished colleagues, he began, that even toward the middle of the 20th century, even though mankind believed it had reached the height of civilization, humans continued to reproduce in exactly the same way as any other mammal. Close to 300 years ago, an illustrious fellow earthling, whose statue you must have seen at the entrance of this building, and whose name need not be spoken, since the entire world knows it, demonstrated through experiment that the ovum of a mammal, once fertilized, can develop in the peritoneal cavity of another individual of the same species, even if that individual is of the male gender. He started by observing ectopic gestations and naturally conducted his first trials on laboratory animals. The challenge remained in modifying, or to put it another way, feminizing, the body of the male animal. And when he achieved this, thanks to intravenous and intraperitoneal injections of ovarian extract, the main problem was practically resolved. The entire scientific world was moved by admiration when, in the great Rockefeller Institute of New York, in the presence of notable doctors from many different countries, our fellow sage opened the stomach of a male guinea pig and took from it 5 perfectly formed and lively little guinea piglets. Similar experiments were later conducted on the human species with remarkable success, but many years passed before such experiments became something more than scientific curiosities. But at last the day came when the governments had to resort to these methods of artificial reproduction and establish special institutions where such projects could be carried out on a large scale, as the only way to stop the depopulation of the earth, which would have occurred had the social conditions of the centuries from which we emerged been allowed to continue. So in this later chapter, Dr. Perez Cerrato is building on an earlier passage in which another character, Celiana, the one on the cover, is outlining the story of the evolution of the family in Via Utopia. In preparing her lecture, Celiana would review how the problem of unwanted offspring seemed to be insurmountable for a long time, since although children had ceased to be a burden for their parents as the state took on the responsibility for their support and education, women increasingly avoided the challenging physiological role that nature assigned them. The depopulation of nations took on alarming proportions. Surely humanity would have died out had a way to use human eggs as soon as they were fertilized not been discovered, a brilliant discovery that took all the dreaded consequences out of love. And, picking up this narrative again later in the novel, Dr. Perez Cerrato explains, now that fatherhood has ceased to be a burden for men, poor or rich, and motherhood does not last beyond conception, the government has reproduction under its immediate care and vigilance. All individuals who are physically or mentally inferior or deficient are sterilized. Only those who are perfect species, capable of producing an ideal offspring, are left with their full genetic faculties. And we must not forget that for these individuals, this distinction implies the obligation to give the community a certain number of children, a duty that has become as unavoidable today as military service, popular elections, or suffrage had been in the past. The selection of ideal breeders begins from the day they are in primary school. Before puberty and after a detailed examination, both medical and psychological, it is decided which children are to be sterilized and which are not. We prefer the purely muscular type and systematically discard the cerebral of both sexes, since experience has shown these to be poor breeders. Since these measures have put a stop to the degeneration of humanity, the population of prisons, mental asylums, and hospitals for the terminally ill have been reduced to almost zero. The tour also included the operating rooms, where Dr. Perez Cerrato explained, we perform the removal of the ovum, the preece, as we say, in its grafting to the foster uterus. The operation, though delicate, is very simple. It comes down to delicately removing the fertilized egg when it has started to attach itself to the mucus of the uterus. In the adjoined room, the incubator, having been feminized, and in whose abdomen another surgeon has already made an incision, awaits. The egg is deposited into the peritoneal cavity as if it were a grain of wheat in a furrow. And if the operation is successful, these days it is rare not to be so. Exactly 281 days later, we perform a laparotomy and remove a perfectly developed and lively child. With progress in aseptic surgery, the dangers of these cesarean sections have become almost non-existent. Now, he continued, I'm going to show you our institution's most intriguing department, the rooms occupied by the incubators and the pavilion where the laparotomies or surgical deliveries take place. Surrounded by a beautiful and open park, the building designed for the incubators consisted of several dormitories with large windows and beds aligned in rows. There was also a large banquet hall, a magnificent spa, a dining hall, a library, and a billiards hall. Lunchtime had not yet arrived, and the self-sacrificing gestators of future humankind, who numbered approximately 600, wandered about the various rooms. Some read novels or newspapers in the library since they were prohibited from any serious reading. One played the piano, while others played cards, chess, or billiards. No small number of them strolled along the avenues of the park, read or conversed under the shade of the trees, or participated in nonviolent sports, suitable for their condition and favorable for a good gestation. They were not permitted to smoke. The oldest of them, who would have believed it, knitted, crocheted, or sewed tiny shirts and exquisite hats. The ages of these subjects ranged from 18 to 45, and all were fat, lucid, and had a healthy complexion, with an air of blissful satisfaction about them. And here's a drawing of a couple of the gestators from the novel. Greeted with displays of friendly camaraderie, the doctor smiled at every one and joked with several of them. Seeing the comical manner with which those most advanced in their pregnancies crossed their hands upon the abdominal sphere, the youngest of the blacks couldn't contain in an opportune moment of laughter that caused him to shed tears the size of garbanzo beans that nearly drowned him. Dr. Cerrato blushed slightly, and Ernesto needed all the strength of his will to not compete with the black man. At last he was able to calm himself, thanks to the stern stares and strong expressions of his companion. "Don't you think, Doctor," Ernesto asked an intern, "that the condition of these sorry-looking men is no less sad and difficult than it was before for women, and that this curiously artificial state will be nothing but an affront to their condition as men and even to their human dignity?" "Each century has their ethic, my friend," replied the young doctor. "Furthermore, the state rewards splendidly the services of these worthy subjects. The life they lead here couldn't be more comfortable, and as my worthy boss said before, the final operation is free from danger. You can be sure," the director, who didn't allow anyone else to speak for very long at a time, interjected, "that the job of incubator is really one of the best paid, and therefore one of the most desired." So I want to end today simply by listing some of the themes that are revealed in these selections, any of which we can discuss in more depth shortly. First, we see the value that is placed on science, medicine, and eugenics, all of which are linked to secularization. Science is presented in the novel as a or the new religion of Via Utopia. Second, we see the social and scientific construction of race as an analytical category and also racism, and these are very linked to one another, and they're both informed by and related to eugenics as well. These themes are especially clear in the descriptions of the African doctors who are visiting the Eugenic Institute. We also see the social and political reproductive apparatus of Via Utopia laid out. This is explained. Women no longer have children because of the physiological burden or fear of childbirth, which has produced a population crisis. Instead, selected breeders pair, the women become pregnant, and the embryo is extracted from the woman and implanted into a male gestator who is feminized with hormones to carry the baby to term. Finally, the baby is delivered through cesarean section, which Orsayas himself helped to pioneer in Mexico. This scenario contains various historical truths. Some women historically and even today have developed hocophobia, which is a clinical or pathological fear of childbirth. And there have been periods of dramatic population growth and decline at different points in history that are related to human-made and natural disasters. War is a major example of the human-made. During war, you see dramatic population decline, and then after war, there are pro-natalist initiatives to try to replenish the population supply. Finally, idealized and real gender roles in Via Utopia are exposed, and so are corresponding ideal constructions of family, sexuality, masculinity, and femininity. And we see these particularly in the discussions of the feminization of male gestators and concerns about their emasculinization. So I hope all of this serves as a sufficient and tantalizing introduction to the novel, and that you'll all find Eugenia to be as interesting as my colleague Erin and I have, and also find our essays to be thought-provoking and helpful in making sense of it. Thank you all again for being here, and I'm happy to take questions. Thanks. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sarah, I think Max mentioned the influence of the book on other writers in Mexico. What about its distribution and effect beyond Mexico?
Very good questions. And we don't really know about the influence on the other writers either. So it was only published in Spanish. This is the first translated edition. It was very hard actually to find information about its reception in Mexico even. I looked through, I expected to find something in the revolutionary newspapers, the socialist newspapers in Yucatan. I didn't find anything. I only found one review in the conservative newspaper, and they were kind of, as Max mentioned, flabbergasted. They just like, is this science? Is this fiction? We don't know what to make of this. And I don't really know about the distribution outside of Mexico. The only thing I've looked to see through WorldCat, like how many libraries it's held in, and not very many. But it's interesting because in Mexico, it's been through several editions. So hopefully, we're hoping that this makes it more distributable. A large reason we wanted to do this was we think it's a great teaching tool. So this will make it more accessible.
So this question is definitely influenced by my being co-director of the Holocaust Living History Workshop, so let me just put that out there. but, and I haven't read the novel yet, but given your description and your readings from it, is there really any doubt as to whether or not this is a dystopian novel? Because it sure sounds like one.
I wonder, I'll have to ask Max what he thinks, but when it starts, it really doesn't seem like one. And then as it goes on, it starts to turn into one. And so that, Aaron and I used that as a kind of key question to organize our critical apparatus. But one person said, well, maybe it's just the post-revolutionary period in Mexico in general. There's a lot of ambivalence given all the kind of social reform that's going on, but it's unclear what the author's intentions are. It seems like, is he changing his mind as he goes along, or did he set out all along to set this up as a utopia and then turn it into a dystopia? It seems like he's kind of exploring these issues, and then by the end he's realizing the answers aren't all there. But I don't know if Max wants to chime in or had.
I agree. I think that it begins as a utopian novel, and at the very end, I think basically in the last chapter or two, is when the view changes and it becomes more complicated. But it is not a dystopian novel in the I don't know, in the traditional sense of the word. It's not very critical about what is going on. It just complicates the issues that are presented, in the novel, in the story itself, right, about human relations.
The issue of love and reproduction is particularly complicated. It starts out setting up this whole thing about free love and separating reproduction and love, and then at the end, it seems that they're suggesting actually they do belong together, and that freedom offered by free love isn't really so free after all. So,
Sarah, thanks so much for your
you.
talk. It was wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to reading this critical edition. So I haven't read it or the novel, and so my question is, Mérida was founded on an ancient indigenous city, and in the Yucatan was and continues to be a highly indigenous populated area. So I'm wondering, do native peoples appear in this novel, and what role do they have, and whether they do or they don't? I mean, what is that? What do you think that author is saying about that, especially since this is so intimately tied up with race and identity in this period?
it's a great question. There are no native people. I mean, he talks about these Neo-Mayan buildings, and I'm trying to think how to. He himself is Cuban and Creole, and I'm thinking later that probably had a lot to do with his orientation to it. He was relatively white. But yeah.
One possible reading is that he, it's a futuristic novel, and there are no Mayans, right? The action takes place in Yucatan. My reading is that the process of natural selection, right, has eliminated that part of the population. So you can see his eugenics, and in that he's similar to Vasconcelos, actually, and the cosmic race, where, there are certain traits associated with dark races that disappear. And so I think there is that view there. But it's amazing to me about the novel, talking about the question of race, is that what the elite oligarchy in white oligarchy in Yucatan was not able to accomplish, in the 60 years of the caste war, in Yucatan, he achieves, right, in this novel, through fiction, very easily. So he is projecting a certain vision that is very problematic, especially at a time of nationalism in Mexico, when we have the rediscovery of the indigenous populations, right, because of the revolution. So it is a complicated novel in that there are many aspects of it that are very forward-looking, but at the same time, there's this blind spots or negations of the racial reality of Mexico, right, and the colonial tradition.
Right. No, and I think that natural selection is used to kind of miraculously wipe out anything that is undesirable. Another issue is sexuality, which is something that early in the 20th century, many people around the world were very interested in aberrant sexualities, and there's no mention in the novel anywhere of homosexuality, so it's just assumed that that has gone away. Then people only copulate to reproduce. So, but yes, no, actually, there's no people that aren't light-skinned in the novel.
In fact,
Either.
the breeders, right? They're blonde and blue-eyed.
Right, right.
Can I follow up on just that aspect, the Hottentot characters? Can you say more about the fact that they were named Booker T and Lincoln? And is there some sort of critique of America and sort of, you know, that sort of racism gets pulled into sort of images of the United States at the time? I'm just sort of curious why the African characters have iconic, you know.
Yeah, there's a couple things. I mean, one is that schools in Mexico are often named after these 19th century heroes, whether they're Mexican or, I don't know, is it Abraham Lincoln is the Lincoln Mandinka? Yeah, as Booker T would be. I forget what I was going to say. Sorry, can you remind me? You asked why those names.
Sort of iconic liberating, you know, African American liberating names, Booker T. Washington.
Okay, and Lincoln.
Why would these are figures are technically coming from Africa? So it just seems like a lot going on in that.
Right. And there is, what I was thinking too, is there is critique of the kind of international context, the United States dominance in this moment and being kind of the interwar period. And they discuss the fact that this is no longer a nation state. It's now become a confederation of different city-states. And they're talking about trade wars have replaced political wars. So the references to the United States may have something to do with that as well. But I'm not sure. I hadn't really thought about the actual racialized connection with those names. So it's a great question.
I'm curious about the illustrations, particularly the cover illustrations. So on first glance, it reminds me a lot of Harry Clarke's illustrations of Poe. So can you say more about the artist? I don't know this artist at all.
We don't know. Yeah, we don't know. Orsais himself studied art. He studied drawing and painting. And so initially, there's also several drawings in the novel, and Aaron and I assumed that they were done by him, but we have no proof of that. And there's a little icon on the cover, and so the press has said that cover illustration Leopoldo Quijano, and I think he's also been credited with the drawings. I'm not sure, though, in the novel as well. So no, we don't know anything more about that. No, but that's definitely a great topic for an art historian or...
Hi, Sarah. I'm curious what might have been any sorts of rights and clearances issues that are attendant upon, publishing and translating a critical edition of a book, originally published in Mexico in 1919. Was there anything involved with that?
Well, since it was 1919 before the, we just saw a copyright thing this morning, but it's in the open clearance, that was fine. And we did use a couple of photographs. We had to ask for permission for those. Apparently there is a slight conflict now in Mexico among two different sides of the family over this book because they, so we're kind of waiting to hear what happens with us. But our press went ahead and published it because it was in public domain. Right, thanks.
Hi, I have not read the book, so I am undaunted by grasp or knowledge of the facts. But it sounds implicitly racist, if not explicitly. And I'm wondering how it kind of fits in the obsessions with race in that period. In Brazil, there was a strategy of branqueamento, which seemed to imply that if there was white and black combination, that the white genes would prevail, and if you did this for generations, you could whiten the population. I always thought that Vasconcelos was speaking of more or less spontaneous unions rather than organized ones in La Raza Cosmica, and he was sort of praising what there was rather than providing a prescription for what should be, at least as I understood it. But there was this obsession with race in this period, and I'm wondering how this book fits in. I mean, it sounds like he's saying to the Brazilians, if you want to whiten the population, this is the way to do it. Or if you want to achieve some other thing. So I'm sort of curious what the, how this fit in the context of racist theories of that period.
Mm-hmm. One thing I was going to say is that the selected breeders that this story focuses on is Ernesto, who you heard about, who's described Greek-like and very white. The other one is Eugenia, a female who's presumed to be from the interior. So it is possible that Eugenia has some indigenous background. We don't know if she's supposed to be from Merida, to answer your question about the Maya. But one thing is there could be references back here to the cosmic race and the first mestizo. But yes, the idea in this is still that through kind of natural selection, the white is going to prevail. And previously in Mexico in the 19th century, they had tried to attract white migrants to whiten the population, and that didn't work very well. So Justo Sierra was it, then decided to focus on, to rely on education instead as a way to civilize, I guess, the natives and encourage people to, I don't know how that would whiten people. You'd have to have white people for them to interbreed with, and that gradually that would get whiter and whiter. So, I mean, he is drawing on this tradition throughout Latin America of ideas about whitening. And I'll say, too, that they had selected breeders, but among the selected breeders, they were allowed to pair off however they wanted. So they weren't, you know, it wasn't like this person was set to go with this person. They just narrowed the pool. So he was kind of taking a middle ground, I guess, between completely controlling it and leaving this natural selection up to fate. But which is kind of something that the author, Orsize, does in many different ways. It's true with evolutionary theory, and you know, I talk about all this in the eugenics chapter, but it's been a while since I've written it or read it myself. But he'll draw on and combine kind of different like sexological theories, which focus on biology in a certain way, and Darwinist theories, which focus in a different way on natural selection, I guess, and error. So I think he's drawing on all the different traditions and thought that's available at the time, is what I can tell you. So thanks.
Hi, Sarah. I understand this is a critical translation, and I understand that you wrote essays and your partner wrote essays, but your co-author. Can you talk a little bit about the intellectual work that goes into doing a translation?
Yeah, it's a lot of work. So initially I was going to do this myself because I really wanted to do this broader project. So I translated the first few chapters, and then Aaron joined me, and we decided when we split up the work that we would have an introduction, we would have 3 additional essays, and so he would do the translation. So the way we did it was I put his work and my work together into an introduction. He wrote the translation initially, and then I wrote 2 more essays, and he wrote a final essay. We passed everything back and forth. So we were both really involved with all aspects of the book. And sometimes, yeah, he'd, write like, oh, I have this phrase, and I'm really stuck, and I don't know, like, what do you think? And so then I'm like, well, how about this? Or we'd look it up. I mean, obviously you have to use dictionary, you have to think about context, you have to look up similar works from the same period to see how they're using this term. Sometimes we'd have to just leave the word out because it was too complicated, or you couldn't catch the nuances in another language. It was helpful actually having 2 translators, I think, because then, he was the main translator, but it was helpful having another set of eyes, because I always remember he wrote this like complicated tale of complicated romantic tale or something, and I was like, how about a love story? He was like, oh yeah, good one, or something. So, and my mother also read the whole translation, and it was really helpful to have, a non-expert go through it and pick out rough passages. But yeah, there's a lot of different aspects that go into it. And I think too, just kind of being able to put it away a little bit or sleep on it too at times is necessary, because it is difficult. So,
Well, how about joining me in a final round of applause?
thank you.